Sega seemed to have an innate skill for creating amazing series and then just dropping them for no apparent reason, and then choosing to ignore them like they never existed in the first place. Yep, not thinking about Jet Set Radio at all. I mean, they're not alone on that. You could say the same thing about Konami and Capcom, but I suppose, unlike Konami, Sega do still make some games. However, most of them seem to be Sonic or Yakuza. But back in the day, they also made games from some legendary franchises. Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, which I covered recently in a What Happened To, and also Panzer Dragoon. But unlike many of those which were series, the game that is the focus of this video didn't even get beyond the first entry, and make no mistake, in my opinion, this game was gone before its time, widely tipped as a game with massive, untapped franchise potential. This is the story of what happened to Gunvalkyrie. Hello everybody, I'm Roy McCoy and welcome to this episode of What Happened To. Oh, Gunvalkyrie, a fantastic Xbox exclusive that I played on the OG Xbox. Yep, I'm that old. It was published by Sega and came with amazing graphics, stunning lighting, amazing lore, and in my opinion, awesome innovation, and really deserves to be a franchise that we're still playing. However, it did have a control system which seemed to divide opinion, with some like me calling it genius and ahead of its time, while others seemed to feel that it was a bit mind-boggling. More about that later. Sadly, this game disappeared and faded into obscurity way before its time, well, in my opinion. Now, before we get started, don't forget to smash that like button as it really does help this video to grow. But now, let's talk about the history of this potential franchise that was never realised. Gunvalkyrie released on March 18th, 2002 in North America, 20 years ago. Oof. 3 days later, on the 21st of March, it came out in Japan, and bringing up the rear, May 17th, 2002 in Europe, the PAL region. I mean seriously, why are we always last? Did we do something wrong? Originally intended for the Sega Dreamcast, a console which holds a fond place in my heart, and whenever I think about it, I get a little bit sad. I mean, it was an awesome console at the time, and knowing that we might never see another Sega console makes me, well, it does make me really sad. The development at some point was moved across to the Xbox to take advantage of its improved hardware and controls. Now, considering the Dreamcast was discontinued in 2001 and the game hit the shelves in 2002, I don't think it comes as a surprise that there was no Dreamcast version. The game was brought to us by Smilebit, an innovative studio bringing us games like Gunvalkyrie, Jet Set Radio, a game I loved, and porting The Typing of the Dead over to the Dreamcast. Yep, that game was a thing, and definitely deserves to feature in another episode of What Happened To, but that's enough about it for today. The studio itself, Smilebit, was an in-house dev team at Sega and founded in 2000 after some restructuring. It was formed of some of the devs who'd worked on things like the Panzer Dragoon games, and during Smilebit's life on top of those games that I mentioned, they also brought us Panzer Dragoon Auto. During some further restructuring by Sega in 2003, Smilebit were merged with Amusement Vision, consolidated into another studio, and rebranded as Sega Sports Research and Development in 2004. Seriously, I preferred the name Smilebit. And they worked on games such as Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, which released in 2007. And since then, the studio went the way of the dinosaurs and ceased to be. But what was Gunvalkyrie, and why is it so special? What made it so divisive? Now, for me, there were several factors that made it special. The graphics, lighting, and character models were incredible for the time. And considering that we're talking about 20 years ago, I think it still looks pretty impressive. The game has a blend of like anime and steampunk vibes. Well, actually not steampunk, it's something the game designers preferred to refer to as elec-punk, due to the world's crazy uses of electricity rather than steam. Also, it had an amazing atmospheric soundtrack, but for me, what made it stand out was the lore and backstory. In some ways you could kind of compare it with something like The Order 1866, although for me the story of that wasn't particularly amazing. That was another game that had franchise potential and had an amazing kind of lore and world building. Those werewolves just really set it off. And it's another game that is due to appear in a What Happened To video at some point. And also, like Gunvalkyrie, it was seemingly undermined somewhat in some eyes by its gameplay choices. Gunvalkyrie was set in an alternative timeline in 1906. The British Empire controls planet Earth and several colony worlds. After losing contact with some of the colonies, which kind of sounds a bit like the plot to Aliens, you find out the colonies are gone and then there's some alien bugs you have to kill. Yep, you're fighting aliens on another planet just after the turn of the century. How awesome does that sound? But how did we Brits take over the world and other planets? Well, it's all thanks to something brought to the planet by Halley's Comet in 1835. A substance called Halley's core appeared all over the world and basically turned some people who came into contact with it into superhumans. These superhumans were known as Halley's Chosen. While still a baby in his mother's womb, Dr. Hebble Gate was affected by the comet and ended up with a superhuman mind. He ended up inventing a bunch of tech like space travel and also worked on genetic engineering, all using Halley's core. Dr. Gate goes missing, leaving the world in shock 4 years before the start of the game. The characters that you take control of belong to Gunvalkyrie organisation, a group who prevent the misuse of tech and whose members are also Halley's Chosen, superhumans, and you're tasked with finding out what happened to Gate as well as the situation on the colony Tir na Nog. The colonists have all disappeared and instead there are bug aliens, and considering Dr. Gate was working on genetic manipulation, the game starts you wondering, did the bugs kill the people or did Gate's experiments turn them into bugs? Like I told you, great story and lore. But what made this game a little more divisive was its gameplay and controls, something that I loved but not everyone seemed to enjoy as much. Now, back in 2002, it was an era of game controls that I called the Wild West. Nothing was really standardized back then. I mean, these days you can pick up any kind of third-person game or a first-person shooter and you instantly know how to move, how to look, how to shoot. But back then, things weren't so settled. One obvious example was while we were tapping X for OK on the PlayStation, it was Circle in Japan. And I get that's not really the same thing, but basically back then devs were experimenting with how to make the most of the controls. Interestingly, the game was originally in development for the Dreamcast, and the initial idea for the controls was to combine the controller with a light gun, which, as innovative as it sounds, considering the controls in their final format caused some issues, I think we dodged a bullet when that system was dropped when moving over to the Xbox. Now, the controls in the final version used both analog sticks, which now I think more people would be open to, but at the time, when the D-pad was still quite utilised, it was a little bit of a step for some, but that said, it was quite unique. The left stick controlled the movement, back, forward, turning, while the right aimed the weapons. You could do a boost by aiming and then clicking the left stick, and clicking the right also turned you. The left trigger was a jump, and when done in tandem with the boost, you could effectively fly, which is important because that's how you get your combos, and it's also vital for getting through some of the 10 levels. Now, I must admit, these controls were a bit of a handful at first, and it did take a bit of getting used to. I've also got to say it wasn't the most intuitive game I've played, but when you knew finally what you were doing, it was such a rewarding experience. That, however, didn't pay off for some reviewers who said the controls effectively made the difficulty curve too sharp, and therefore they said it was tough and clunky. I suppose also in 2002, games were just kind of creeping into a more standard format in more ways than one, and also we started seeing a little bit more hand-holding. So to have a game this innovative and difficult, well, maybe it was a bit before its time. I'm not going to compare it to the Souls games just because it was difficult. It's such a flippant comment, but I will say this, considering Demon's Souls came out 7 years after this, and it was initially still treated as being too tough due to its controls and difficulty curve, and in fact in the first few weeks the game was panned by its critics before some YouTubers made it famous. I can't help but wonder if Gunvalkyrie had come out 8 years later, would people have been more open to its innovation? And if you're interested in that story about how Demon's Souls nearly didn't get any love, and how we nearly lost it, and how close we were to not having a Dark Souls trilogy, check out this video I made about it. I'll put the link in the description. In terms of difficulties, there were 2 playable characters who represented different difficulties. At the beginning of most of the 10 levels, players had the choice of picking either Kelly or Sabaruta. Sabaruta is slower and less maneuverable in the air but has a stronger weapon which can target one enemy at a time. He's the harder difficulty while Kelly is faster and more maneuverable but her gun is weaker and she's able to kind of scattergun and hit multiple targets, which makes her the normal difficulty, and the game with her was easier and a bit more frantic. Now if you're wondering who's who, Kelly's the girl on the box cover. Literally she's everywhere and she was basically used to market the game. I mean, I wonder why. While if you look very closely you can kind of make out Sabaruta, and I really don't know if I'm saying his name right, but I'm doing the best I can. As for its reception, on Metacritic it has a score of 73 out of 100, which is pretty average. However, some critics absolutely loved it, such as IGN, who gave it 9 out of 10. Interestingly, in Japan on release week it sold 6,000 units, becoming the only Xbox game to make it to the top 30 best-selling games. I mean, that's probably due to its themes, its anime and elecpunk, steampunk, whatever you want to call it, style. In 2009, Games Radar included it on a list of games with untapped franchise potential. So now I need to answer this simple question: could we ever see another one? And no, not at all. 20 years has gone, the studio's closed, and probably most people who worked on it have either retired by now or moved on. It's even less likely than Jet Set Radio, which I also don't have much hope for. The rights are presumably still held by Sega, who seem to have this "I've never heard of it" policy whenever anybody mentions some of their older games. So to be honest, I think that this game is dead and buried, and that is an absolute tragedy. While it seemed to sell well in Japan during its first week, we can assume that it didn't really set the world on fire. But I think with all that restructuring, I don't think it would have really mattered possibly anyway, because probably the controls and the issue that some people had put Sega off from trying again as a kind of defining blow. But I don't think the question is, will we ever see another one? It's, should we? And yes, this game deserves to live on, and if we don't ever get another Gunvalkyrie, Gunvalkyrie 2, it should be held up as a benchmark of world building, lore creation, and devs taking risks. This was a time when AAA just went for it, and I hope that someone out there, much like I said with Red Ninja End of Honor, sees this game and gets inspired to make something in the same vein, whether it's Gunvalkyrie 2 or just inspired by it. Let me know in the comments below if this is a game that you would love to see, if you've got fond memories of it like I do, or if you didn't enjoy it or you just kind of missed it. But from me today, all it leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching, and this is Roy McCoy, out!